Hello, my name is Andy Pavord. In this video, I want to address the question of whether the U.S. government can eliminate its huge budget deficit by improving efficiency. I am sure that you have seen press and media reports describing the huge budget deficits that our government runs each year. And I'm also sure that you have seen many people argue that the government is bloated and inefficient, and that by improving efficiency, we can make take meaningful steps towards reducing the budget deficit. Now, my approach to this question is to provide you with an overview of the federal budget. By providing you the basic facts about the budget, I can give you the information that you need to make up your own mind on this issue. Now, before we proceed, I want to let you know that this video is part of a series on the federal budget that I am publishing on my YouTube channel, The Federal Budget with Andy Pavord. In this series, I will be exploring the complexities of the federal budget. We will discuss current budget issues, such as the president's budget, which will be submitted in the next few months, the debt limit, continuing resolutions, and the appropriation bills that will be turned into the law that governs our federal government spending over the next year. We will also discuss the history of the federal budget. So if you are interested in learning more about the federal budget and the process for creating the federal budget, please subscribe to this YouTube channel by clicking the subscribe button that appears below the screen. So let's begin by looking at the Congressional Budget Office's latest budget projections. So the CBO is charged with publishing projections about the federal budget on a periodic basis. And these are the latest that were provided in January 2025. Now, what they show is that deficits are going to continue over the next 5 years. Let's take a look at this. You see that the revenue in 2024 was $4.9 trillion, trillion, not billion, trillion, and spending was $6.75 trillion. The deficit, therefore, was $1.832 trillion. That's a huge amount of money, and we'll talk more about that as this video goes on. But let's look at the trend. The trend shows that it's not really going to get much better, right? As the fiscal year, and I should say that the fiscal year, when we say 2024, we're talking about the fiscal year which begins on October. So 2024 fiscal year began October 1st of 2023 and ran till September 30th of 2024. So the deficits now are going to keep going pretty much stable. But there's one thing to note about these projections. CBO is required to make projections based on current law. And the current law is that the tax cuts enacted in 2017 are due to expire after 2025. So look what happens to revenue from 2025 to 2026. It goes up by $400 billion, according to CBO. What that means is the result of the increase in taxes that will result when the tax provisions of the 2017 Act expire. Now, this provision includes corporate income tax cuts and also individual tax cuts of about 3% on the rates that every American pays on their income taxes. So if those tax cuts expire, then budget revenue, as you can see, goes up. Federal revenue goes up and continues to go up in 2027. But if these tax cuts are renewed, then you can see that the federal revenue will go down several $100 billion and the deficit will go up. So part of the issue is not just the budget deficit under current law, but it's the budget deficit under the changes in the law that are proposed by the current administration, specifically the desire to extend those tax cuts. So what the challenge will be for the new administration is to find spending cuts or tax revenue increases that offset these tax cuts, because otherwise the budget deficit will increase. Now, if we're going to talk about whether the federal government is going to be reduce its deficit due to efficiency, we need to talk briefly about the idea of efficiency versus the idea of policy. So if we're improving efficiency, we're reducing the inputs required to produce a service of benefits. But if we're making policy decisions, we reduce the level of services or benefits delivered to customers or citizens or whoever is currently getting the money. So let's take a look at the Veterans Benefits Administration as an example of how this can work. Now, currently, the Veterans Benefit Administration spends about $2.6 billion a year on administering the veterans benefits programs. And specifically, these are the programs such as disability payments, educational services, and things like that. Now, the output of these inputs is about $152 billion worth of benefits that serve 5.7 million veterans. So if we're improving efficiency, let's say, and this is just hypothetical, that we come up with a program or the government comes up with a program that improves the efficiency of Veterans Benefits Administration by 50%. Then you would reduce spending by $1.3 billion, and you'd reduce the number of FTEs from 18,000 to roughly 9,000. But under this hypothetical, we're just improving efficiency, so the output would stay the same. So that's how we do. Now, one thing to note about this is that a 50% improvement of efficiency only generates about a $1.3 billion in savings. That's because the amount of money, and we'll see this as we go forward, that the federal government spends on administration relative to the amount of benefits that it delivers is actually very small. $2.6 billion about delivers $152 billion in benefits. So it's about a 2% administration expense revenue in the Veterans Benefits Administration. So now let's talk about a policy issue, a policy approach. In a policy approach, you're reducing the level of services or benefits delivered to the customers. So let's take a scenario where we may decide to make a policy decision, or the government decides to make a policy decision to reduce the benefits that veterans receive by 50%, by its maybe changing the eligibility rules. So in this scenario, you save $75 billion. You're reducing benefits from $152 billion to $76 billion. So this scenario, you're actually reducing the budget expenditures, government's expenditures, by a significant amount. And the point here is that it's generally policy decisions that are required to make significant budget reductions. And we'll talk about that more as we go through the federal budget. So let's go take a look at the big picture of the federal budget. Let's do an overview of the federal budget. And let's just start with the current level of spending in the federal budget versus the economy. Now, I'm going to use 2023 actual spending. And I know that's a couple years old, but that's because the president, due to the transition, has not submitted the new president's budget, and therefore the data is not available like it normally would be. Now, this is just because this happens every year when you have a new president. When the president's inaugurated on January 20th, you can't expect them to submit a budget on February, which is the time it's normally done. So let's look at this slide. The first thing to note that the budget of the United States is huge. In FY 2023, federal spending encompassed almost 1 out of every $4 spent in the U.S. economy. The total economy was about $27 billion, and federal spending was almost over $6 trillion. And then if you look at CBO forecasts about the federal spending, it's going to pretty much stay the same. The CBO forecasts that spending will increase to 24.8% of the federal budget deficit, of gross national product, of the gross domestic product of the economy. And then it's going to decline over the next years in 2029 slightly to 24.1%. But let's just, to put this in context, recognize that the US federal government spending is greater than the total GDP of every country in the world except China. Federal spending is $6 trillion in 2023. Now it's going to be up to $7 trillion in 2025. And China's GDP is 17.8 trillion. Another way to think about this is the federal budget is 50% bigger than the German economy, and it's 50% bigger than the Japanese economies. And it is more than 3 times the GDP of the Russian Federation. So the first place to start in thinking about the federal budget is to recognize how huge it is. But now let's turn to, what does the federal budget actually purchase? And here we're going to talk about outlays by category. Now, outlays is the concept that when the federal budget actually spends money. So an outlay is when the federal budget, when a federal organization actually pays a check to somebody, an employee or a contractor. That's an outlay because the money is outlaid. It's leaving the federal government through a check from the United States Treasury. So let's look at what we spend. Now, there's 2 categories of spending to look at. First is what is referred to as mandatory spending, and that's in the light blue here. And 72% of outlays were funded by permanent laws that mandate the conditions under which individuals and organizations are to receive payments from the government. The classic example of this is Social Security. It's the Social Security program. Because if you reach a certain age, the government, by current law, is required to pay you money. So it's mandatory. So Social Security is almost at $1.3 trillion. Is about 22% of total outlays. So the payments to Social Security recipients is the biggest source of outlays in the federal government. But then it's followed closely by Medicare at $800 billion and Medicaid at $600 billion. These are programs that provide money by current law. And it takes an act of Congress to change a mandatory program signed by the president into law. It takes a law to stop spending mandatory programs. The other major mandatory programs we're going to talk about in the next slide, but I also want to note the interest payments on the nation's debt is a key part of mandatory spending. And in 2023, it was $600 billion, but in 2025, it's going to be near $1 trillion. So look at this huge type of spending, and you will see that most of the programs are set by law, and through the normal appropriations process, they cannot be changed. Notice then the breakout between defense and non-defense discretionary spending. Now, discretionary spending is budgeted through the appropriation process through 1-year appropriations or sometimes multi-year appropriations. And this is what you hear about in the press all the time. When you hear that there's going to be a government shutdown, the expenses in the mandatory side do not stop because of government shutdown. It's only the discretionary expenses, because discretionary expenses require appropriation laws that are normally passed on an annual basis, though sometimes it's multiple years. So every year, in theory, Congress has discretion over how much to spend on discretionary programs, because it takes an act of Congress to start spending on discretionary spending. So that's the key distinction here. For mandatory programs, it takes an act of Congress to stop the spending because the spending's on automatic pilot. But for discretionary spending, it takes an appropriation law to start the spending for the next year. So now let's take a look at other mandatory outlays. And I need my glasses for this. So what are the biggest other mandatory spending? Now, other mandatory spending is a lot of money, about $1 trillion. What's the biggest spending? Federal employee retirement. So federal employees, and here we're only talking about civilian federal employees, the federal government spends $179 billion a year on that. Now, these are mandatory payments, but it would take a law to change benefits to change the retirement that federal employees have earned through their service. The next biggest source of mandatory outlays is the food and nutrition assistance. This is food stamps and other assistance programs devoted to helping poor people by giving them food and other payments. So that's 165 billion. Again, these programs cannot be stopped unless Congress passes a law. I want to hammer that idea home. The next biggest source of spending is veterans' disability and other payments to veterans. Veterans who've been disabled through their service are entitled to disability payments. And that's a huge amount of money each year, about $150 billion. Then there's the deposit insurance program. Government outlaid $91 billion for that. Now, most of this is funded not through taxes, but through fees to banks. So this $90 billion isn't paid by your taxes. It's paid by fees that banks pay to participate in the FDIC program. Then there's the Affordable Care Act subsidies, almost $80 billion in subsidies through the Affordable Care Act program that are put in as poor people or people that don't make a lot of money go onto the Obamacare. They get subsidized, and that's how much that costs. Then supplemental security income. This is disability income, earned income tax credit. In 2023, we're still paying out for COVID. There was $53 billion there. And then there's various other programs that I've lumped together. So these are important programs that if you're going to make savings, you have to decide who's going to get their benefits cut, who's going to get their payments cut. So let's now go to look at non-defense discretionary spending. In 2023, that was $911 billion, almost $1 trillion. But let's look at what actually the government spends money on. Veterans benefits services. Most of this money goes to pay for the health care that veterans receive due to their service in the military, the injuries they've received, or just the general health benefits that they get. It's $130 billion. That pays for the largest healthcare system, the VAs in the world, a system with over 300,000 employees and many, many hospitals. So that's the biggest non-defense discretionary spending. Next is education, training, employment, and other social services. Now, this includes about $24 billion for student aid. And this is the college age that allows low and middle income Americans to attend college. But there's also in there $15 billion for special education and other assistance for disadvantaged students. And there are other programs that pay benefits to low income counties and local governments to help subsidize their education. Interestingly, most of the benefits go to poor areas in the rural, many Republican areas are receiving this education funding, areas that vote for Republicans. Next is the transportation programs that fund the improvements to roads, but also rail and mass transit. Then the income security, about $100 billion for income security. And this is your kind of classic welfare benefits, the temporary assistance to families and stuff like that. Then there's healthcare benefits. Part of this is the healthcare we provide to Native Americans, but it's also other healthcare programs. Now look at international affairs. That's $83 billion out of a total spending of over $6 trillion. It's not that much, but that's the source of soft power, the ability of the United States to project its power around the world without resort to military force. Then there's the administration of justice. That's the FBI, the Bureau of Prisons, the court systems, and all the things that we need to run a justice system in the United States, about $70 billion. And then you'll see science and technologies, community development, energy and natural resources, all in the $40 to $50 billion, and just general government. And that's things like the management of the Social Security program, the Treasury, and things like that. That's about $34 billion. And then the other programs. So that just gives you an idea of what we actually spend money for in the federal government. Let's go to next and look at what is it that the government buys. Now here, because of the way the government presents data, I'm going to talk about obligations. Now, obligations are different than outlays. An obligation occurs when the federal government makes a binding agreement to pay for something that will result in outlays once that thing is received. Now, the classic example is a contract. So the government contracts with, a defense contractor to build an aircraft carrier, and it says, okay, we're going to put, hundreds of billions of dollars or whatever that price is. The government in its accounting system makes an obligation, but it doesn't pay the producer of the aircraft carrier until it actually delivers the aircraft carrier, which might be many years down the road. So now we're talking about obligations, and this is the data that presents. So what is the government obligating money for? First, it's obligating money for insurance claims and indemnities. And that $2.8 trillion, part of that insurance claim is Social Security, because Social Security is technically an insurance program. So all that $1.38 trillion is, that we talked about before for Social Security is part of that funding in this category. Then the other thing the government does is it gives grants, grants for all kinds of things, for road building, for community development. But the biggest grant is for Medicaid. And so that's the thing the government does, is gives a lot of grants. But now let's look at these two slices of the pie: military compensation and civilian compensation. This is the funding for federal employees, both military and civilian. And I want you to notice how relatively small that is. It's only about $500 billion out of $6 trillion total spending, or $9 billion of obligations, if you look at it that way. So it's really less than 5%. So if you were to magically improve efficiency of federal government by reducing 50% of civilian employees, you're only going to save $150 billion. And remember, our deficit is $1.8 trillion. So reducing federal employees is not going to make a meaningful contribution to solving the budget deficit. And so then you can see contracts, and that's providing the contractors that work for the government, but it's also buying supplies like military supplies, like ammunition and things like that. And then there's capital assets, buying buildings, buying additions to the park, but also large-scale military facilities and things like that, weapons. Then there's interest payments, and then reimbursables, and which are things like fees for park service and stuff like that. So that is really what the government buys. And the point I want to make is the government, relatively proportion to total obligations, obligates relatively small amount for people, for employees. But let's dig down a little bit at examples. Let's take a look at a particular department to kind of dig down and to understand how the government spends money. Let's look at the Department of Agriculture. In fiscal year 2023, the Department of Agriculture obligated $284 billion. That's a lot of money, right? Most of that money went to payments to individuals. Now, most of those were for food supplement payments, but also subsidies to farmers. So that's $162 billion. That's cash out the door to people. Individual people are cashing the checks. Then let's look at it. Then it's services. And most of these services are things like marketing services, safety, conservation. It's services provided to people. Then there's grants. Then there's loans. And let's look at this at administration. Out of that $284 billion, only $8 billion goes for administration. So again, improving efficiency by 50%, you can save about $4 billion. Now that's assuming that it's possible, and it may not be possible. But let's say it is possible to save 50% in administration. You only save a limited amount of money. If you're going to make reductions in the Department of Agriculture spending, you're going to have to either reduce payments to individuals, reduce services, reduce grants. And these are not efficiency savings. These are policy decisions about who should get the money from the federal government. Now let's talk about employment in the federal government. There are 2.238 million federal employees in 2023. And where do they work? The vast majority of them work in the Department of Defense, 775,000, the Department of Veterans Affairs, and that's mostly the staff of the hospitals that take care of veterans after they leave the services, their healthcare needs. That's 434,000 because it's a really big hospital system. Then there's 212,000 people who work for Homeland Security. And in the next slide, we're going to go drill down on that a little bit. But then in HHS and security and all the social programs, 144,000. Department of Justice, 115,000. That's the Bureau of Prison Guards. That's the FBI. That's the other law enforcement agencies, the Secret Service. And we'll take a look at that. Then there's Treasury. The Treasury Department has 99,000 employees. Most of those people work for the IRS. Then agriculture, you can see the other departments. So the big thing to take away about this is the majority of federal employees, civilian employees, support national security, either in Department of Defense, Homeland Security, or serving veterans after their service. Now let's look at the Department of Homeland Security. Let's drill down on that a little bit. Let's look at the FTEs in the Department of Homeland Security. So there's 212,000 employees, full-time equivalent employees. And the idea of a full-time equivalent is that it's a full-time person. So if you have two part-time people working, 20 hours a week, they add up to one full-time person. So this isn't the number of positions, it's the number of full-time equivalent employees. So look at this. Customs and Border Protection is 64,000 employees in 2023. That's not likely to go down in this administration. Then there's the Transportation Security Administration, has 63,000 employees. Those are the people that protect you as you check into airport. Immigration Enforcement, 20,000 employees. Citizenship and Immigration Services, 20,000 employees. And FEMA is about 17,000 employees. So this just, again, gives you a sense of who people work for, where people work in the Department of Homeland Security. Okay, now I want to take a minute to talk about the Social Security Trust Fund, because Social Security's financing is going to be huge going to have a huge impact on the federal deficit over the next few years. Now take a look at this chart. The blue is the revenue for the Social Security Trust. The revenue. The yellow is the cost. That's the payments that go out each year. And it's about $1.3 trillion, as you can see in 24. Now, the way Social Security works is all the revenue from your Social Security taxes, the payroll taxes that you pay each year, goes into the Social Security Trust Fund. The other source of revenue for the Social Security Trust Fund is the taxes on Social Security benefits paid by people who work over certain thresholds. So if you make between $25,000 and $34,000 and you're married, you pay 50%, you pay taxes on 50% of your Social Security benefits. Now, it's important to note that those taxes that you pay on your Social Security benefits, if you're in that age, in that income bracket, go into the Social Security Trust Fund. So if you eliminate those taxes, as President Trump has promised to do, you reduce the funding for the Social Security Trust Fund. Similarly, if you make more money, between $34,000 and $44,000, you pay up to 85%. So the money coming into the trust fund is the payroll taxes, and the income tax paid on Social Security benefits. The key thing to know here is that the revenue is less than the money going out. So this is the difference is paid for out of the balances that exist in the trust fund. Because what happened for many, many years, the revenue was greater than the expenditures. And that allowed the government to build up the trust fund. Now, they did this intentionally, and it was done during the Reagan administration back in the 1980s, because back then they recognized that we were going to have the retirement of the baby boom generation, and we needed to build up savings to pay for that. So they built the Social Security Trust Fund up. The Social Security Trust Fund consists of only federal treasury bonds. So it's all federal debt in the trust fund. But what is happening now is that the expenditures are greater than the revenue. So every year the trust fund declines. You can see that. So a little bit here, the trust fund goes down. A little bit more, trust fund keeps going down. And here's what's happening. In 2033, the trust fund will be depleted. So then what happens? Because we no longer have the trust fund to make up the difference between revenues and expenditures. Well, by law, the expenditures must be reduced to bring to the level of revenue. And what that means, in 2034, there will be an approximately 25% reduction in every American that receives Social Security, the amount of money they receive each month. A 25% cut in Social Security benefits will occur under current law in 2034. Now, this chart's a little obsolete because we passed the Social Security Fairness Act in the last few months. That act added a significant amount of expenditure, about $200 billion, to Social Security. What that act did is it provided payments for law enforcement and other officials that currently were not part of the Social Security program. So that program, that law will actually accelerate the depletion of the Social Security Trust Fund, and actually will move the payments, when payments reduced, to about 2033. So you got to ask yourself, is Congress really going to allow a reduction in benefits of 25%? Or are they going to find approximately $400 billion to make up the hole in the Social Security program going after 2033? So when we think about those CBO projections of the deficit, I think we need to add around 2033 another $400 billion, because I don't think the Congress is going to allow Americans to take a 25% reduction in their Social Security. I might be wrong. They might do that, but I think the political fallout would be pretty brutal. So now let's turn to federal receipts. Where does the federal government get its money? So this is the receipts in 2023. And notice that the biggest source of revenue for the federal government is the individual income taxes. About $2 trillion, $2.1 trillion was paid in federal income taxes to the federal government. The next biggest source is that Social Security retirement and receipts. These are the Social Security taxes that go to fund the Social Security programs that we just talked about. That's the second biggest source of income. The third biggest source, of only about $419 billion, is corporate income taxes. Corporate income taxes were only 9% of revenue. And then customs duties. There's a lot of talk about increasing tariffs to generate revenue. And currently, customs only generate about $80 billion, which is a tiny percentage of the federal revenue. And then there's excise taxes, about $75 billion. So that's the source of federal revenue. But let's talk a little bit about who pays the income tax, because this is a big thing on both sides. The Republicans want to push down income taxes so we pay less, and Democrats want the income taxes to go up on the wealthy. So let's just take a minute and look at this chart. So what this chart does is the blue box and the green box together equal the total income adjusted gross income for that income category. Now, this data is provided by the IRS, and they have a table that I constructed this out of. And so that what this says for people who make under $50,000 a year, and there's 70 million of them, they pay about $64 billion in taxes, and they have only 576 billion then left over after tax income to spend. So 70 million have $576 billion in after tax income. Now let's go to the other end of the income stream, the people who make more than $10 million a year. There's only 34,000 of those. And their total contribution is they pay about $266 billion a year in taxes. And then after taxes, they have a $671 billion in disposable after-tax incomes. So they're paying about 27% of their income in taxes at the highest level. Now, that is a higher percentage than people at the lowest level, but it's significantly a lot more income available. Now, the thing to think about this, let's look at the federal, remember the federal deficit is about $1.8 trillion. So let's ask the question, can you solve the budget deficit by taxing the rich? So let's add up the income of everybody the untaxed income of everybody who makes more than $500,000 or more than $1 million. Let's do it $1 million. And that's about $1.6 trillion if I've done my math right. So even if we tax 100% of the income of people who make more than $1 million, we can't eliminate the budget deficit. Okay. And of course, if you tax 100% of people's income, they're not going to work. So that's not a viable program. But what this tells us is that if we're going to increase revenue from the federal government, we really have to hit the middle class. It's only by taxing the middle class that you can make massive increase in revenue to solve the budget deficit. That's a really difficult concept, but frankly, that's the approach that countries that have strong social welfare programs such as Finland, Norway, and Denmark, they all have very, very high taxes on the middle class. That's how they generate their revenue for the welfare state. The United States, which is very relatively low tax compared to European countries, has rejected that approach. We've kept taxes relatively low, really across the whole income spectrum. And that has caused a limitation on the revenue the federal government collects each year. Another thing to note, though, is that this chart talks about adjusted gross income as calculated for tax returns. And the question is that accurate, true representation of the wealthy? Because they have ways of avoiding taxes, and they have ways of lowering their adjusted gross income. So this chart might not be entirely accurate because there might be more money here that doesn't show up in their taxes. But on the poor side, these figures also do not show federal benefits for things like the earned income tax credit, the benefits they receive, such as Social Security payments for low-income people and stuff like that. So there is a lot of income that doesn't show up in this chart that you just should be aware of. So let's look at 12. Now let's get back to the deficit, what we started this presentation about. The Congressional Budget Office baseline deficit projections show, as we discussed earlier, a continuing deficit for the next 10 years. But it's important to note, remember, these deficits assume that the tax cuts from 2017 are going to expire. And if those are renewed, there'll be a bigger increase in the deficit of about $300 to $400 billion from 2026 on out. The other thing to note in this chart is in 2033, when the Social Security Trust Fund is expired, there's probably going to be a need to find another $400 billion in spending. So when you take that into account, the tax cuts from 2017, renewing them and fully funding the Social Security program, that really adds about $600 to $700 billion in 2033. So that's more like a $3.5 trillion deficit in those years. So let's now look at what that's going to do to the total debt. And this is really what this is the amount of treasury bonds that have been issued and that the government is paying interest on. And so that is going to balloon and almost double in the next 10 years to $50 trillion, 122% of GDP. And again, that does not include spending to solve the Social Security cuts in 2033, and it doesn't reflect reduction in revenues from continuing the tax cuts from 2017. So that's something to think about. So now I'd like to close by let's just figure out who owns the federal debt. Who actually owns all these treasury bonds? Now, important to note that the federal government owns a significant portion of treasury bonds. The Federal Reserve has about $5 trillion. The Federal Reserve buys U.S. Treasury bonds, but also various federal funds buy Treasury bonds. The Social Security Trust Fund owns several $1 trillion in trust bonds, and of course that's declining as the trust fund declines. But also, like the Federal Employee Retirement owns $1 trillion worth of federal of treasury bonds, and the military retirement, those funds own bonds. But so the government owns a big chunk of its own debt. But then mutual funds own about $3.6 trillion, investors in mutual funds. State and local governments, to manage cash flow, buy significant amounts of treasury bonds. Depository interest of $1.6 trillion is banks, basically banks buying treasury funds. Private pension funds own about almost $900 billion worth of treasury bonds. State and local government trust pension funds own a significant amount. But then other savings and other investors own a lot, $6 trillion. And then there's a lot of talk about this. The foreign investors, they own about $7.9 trillion. Foreigners own of U.S. total debt. Now, the biggest borrowers are Japan, $1.1 trillion, China, $816 billion worth of U.S. Treasury bonds, the United Kingdom, then the Cayman Islands, and Luxembourg. So individuals in these small countries buy a lot of U.S. Treasury bonds, and it'd be a whole another subject to figure out why does Cayman Islands, how are they able to own $420 billion worth of U.S. Treasury bonds, a little island like that? But that gives you a sense of who owns the federal debt. So that concludes my presentation, but I think you can think now a little bit better about the question of whether improved efficiency can really solve the budget deficit. And you can think about that now with the data that you have in these slides. The key thing to note, though, is that our government bureaucracy is actually a really small percentage of total spending. It's only, remember, the federal employees are only about $300 billion out of $9 trillion in obligations. So what that tells you is that reductions of significant spending is maybe more of a policy decision, but I'll let you make your own thoughts about this. I would like to say finally that if you want to see these PowerPoint slides, they'll be available either on my LinkedIn page or the American Association for Budget and Program Analysis, which is a nonprofit, on their LinkedIn page. And so I'd just like to thank you for listening to this presentation and hope that this sparks an interest in the federal budget and that you'll consider looking at other videos in this series. So till next time, goodbye.